Have you ever wondered, does becoming president of the United States make you rich, or does it actually make you poorer? Most folks assume, if you're the boss of the White House, your pockets must be overflowing, but history, as always, loves its paradoxes. One war hero marched into the White House crowned with glory and marched out with only $80 to his name. Dying of cancer, he spent his final breaths racing against the clock to write his memoirs, his last desperate act to keep his family from being destitute. One founding father owned tens of thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved laborers, even a whiskey distillery. Yet he was so short on cash at times that he had to take out quick loans just to pay his workers. Land rich, cash poor, sounds familiar, doesn't it? And then there were the modern presidents, men who spent their entire careers as public servants, even ranking among the poorest in the Senate. Yet within a few years of leaving office, suddenly they're pulling in millions from book deals and speaking tours. The wealth of American presidents isn't just a tale of rich versus poor. It's a full-blown drama, sometimes tragic, sometimes comic, and always tangled up with the fortunes of the nation itself. In this video, we'll travel through each tier of presidential wealth, from the so-called under $1 million club all the way to the controversial billionaire tier. And to be fair, here's the ground rule up front. All figures are estimates, adjusted to $2024 based on academic studies, financial archives, and presidential libraries.
Not equal leadership.
Some entries will carry the label disputed, meaning historians still argue over them. And honestly, that's the beauty of history. It's never just one voice, but a many-sided conversation. So, are you ready to ride the roller coaster of presidential fortunes? I promise you'll be surprised, you'll laugh a little, and you may even shake your head and think. So being president doesn't exactly guarantee billionaire status after all. Strange as it sounds, quite a few men who sat in the most powerful chair on earth walked away from it nearly empty-handed. Abraham Lincoln, rich in honor, poor in cash. Lincoln, the log cabin boy from Kentucky, rose through the law courts and the brutal arena of politics. As president, his salary was $25,000 a year, about $739,000 in today's dollars. A decent paycheck, sure, but peanuts compared to the burden of steering the Union through Civil War. Then came Ford's Theater. His sudden death left Mary Todd Lincoln and their sons scrambling. It's a cruel irony. The man now hailed as America's greatest president left behind a family counting pennies. Andrew Johnson, from tailor's needle to empty pockets. Johnson began as a tailor's apprentice, stitching coats just to get by. He climbed rung by rung, mayor, governor, senator, vice president, and finally president after Lincoln's assassination. But decades of public service paid less than a rookie on a minor league baseball team. By the time he left the White House, his wallet was as thin as his patience, with nothing much to show for his service but enemies in Congress. James Buchanan, poor in purse and in legacy. Buchanan, the last pre-Civil War president, lived almost entirely off his government pay. No side business, no savvy investments. His financial record mirrored his presidential one, uninspiring. In most rankings, he lands near the very bottom, both in money and in merit. James Garfield, a genius cut short. Garfield was a prodigy, self-taught, professor by his 20s, then congressman, and eventually president. But fate cut him down just months into his term at the age of 49. He never had the chance to build wealth. His legacy? Not dollars, but a reminder that brains and public service sometimes matter more than bank accounts. Woodrow Wilson, the cashlight scholar. Wilson spent most of his life in academia, professor, president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, before the presidency. He earned steady salaries but never built businesses or estates. In modern terms, he was that brilliant professor who could quote Cicero but still struggled to pick up the dinner tab. His wealth was in ideas, not in dollars. Ulysses S. Grant from $80 to $450,000. Grant, the Civil War hero adored by the nation, received gifts, land, and plenty of goodwill. But he made a rookie mistake, trusting a smooth-talking Wall Street operator. Overnight, his fortune vanished. In his pocket, $80. Ravaged by throat cancer, Grant grabbed his last weapon, his pen. He poured his final months into writing his memoirs, Racing Death itself. And he won. Published after his passing, the book earned $420, $450, $000 back then. Over $10 million today for his family. From bankruptcy to literary triumph, Grant gave America not only victory on the battlefield, but one of the greatest presidential memoirs ever written. Why were so many presidents broke? The 19th century wasn't built for getting rich in politics. Salaries were modest, enough to live, not enough to build dynasties. No book deals, no $250,000 speaking tours, no Netflix contracts waiting after office. Fate was brutal. Assassinations, illness, or simply dying too soon to accumulate wealth. And for many, honor in service outweighed personal fortune. But not every president walked out broke. Some managed to build just enough cushion to live comfortably. Maybe not popping champagne in Hollywood mansions, but not worrying about the next meal either. That middle ground, the comfortable but not wealthy class, is where we head next. If the last chapter was the broke boys club, here we meet the presidents who at least had something in the bank. Not tycoons, not dynasts, but men who left office with enough to live decently. Yet their stories are anything but steady. Here we find bankruptcies, reinventions, and even presidents who played poor for the cameras. William McKinley from governor to bankruptcy. McKinley was a small-town lawyer who worked his way up to governor of Ohio and eventually president. But one bad financial decision, co-signing loans for friends, wiped him out. He went bankrupt, relying on political allies and donors to dig him out of debt. It's one of the earliest lessons in presidential finance. You can win the White House, but one wrong signature can still sink you faster than a bad pitch in the bottom of the ninth. Harry Truman, the poor president? Or was he? Truman is remembered as the humble, salt-of-the-earth president who left the White House broke, living on a modest pension. That image is baked into American memory. The simple man from Missouri, proof that not every president cashed in. But newer research, including a 2021 analysis, suggests Truman's net worth may have been closer to $6-7 million in today's dollars, with real estate and savings that rarely made the headlines. A perfect case study in how public image and financial reality don't always line up. Truman might not have been Wall Street rich, but he wasn't clipping coupons either. Calvin Coolidge, New England frugality. Silent Cal grew up in the austere culture of New England thrift, and he carried that attitude straight into the White House. No flashy investments, no speculative gambles, just steady salaries and a modest estate. Coolidge's legacy wasn't measured in banknotes, but in his plain, almost old Yankee style of living. To some, he looked admirably frugal, to others, almost comically bland. Either way, Coolidge showed that not every president measured success in dollars. Gerald Ford, the dawn of the paid speech era. Ford was a career congressman thrust into the presidency by Watergate. His financial breakthrough didn't come while in office, but after. In his first year out of the White House, Ford earned over $1 million modern value from paid speeches and corporate board seats. Suddenly, being an ex-president wasn't a quiet retirement. It was a global brand. Ford cracked open the door, and every president since has walked right through. You could say he invented the presidential version of the aftermarket career. Jimmy Carter, from peanut farmer to Nobel laureate. Carter left office without much wealth, just a peanut farm, some debts, and a reputation for honesty. But his comeback story is remarkable. He wrote books, gave speeches, and in 2002 won the Nobel Peace Prize, which came with a $1 million award. But more than money, Carter transformed the idea of a post-presidency. He became the people's president, a tireless advocate for human rights, democracy, and public health. His fortune grew modestly, but his moral capital grew beyond measure. What we see here is the turning point. In the 19th century, politics wasn't a path to wealth. It was almost a financial sacrifice. By the mid-20th century, the rules began to change. Suddenly, presidents could write books, tour the world stage, and turn influence into income. Some stayed modest, others reinvented themselves, and in doing so, they reshaped what Americans expect from an ex-president. But some presidents went further. They didn't just escape poverty, they built fortunes, estates, investments, dynastic wealth. These were the asset builders, the men who turned power into lasting property. And that's where we're heading next. In this tier, presidents finally start to pull away from the just-getting-by crowd. They weren't tycoons, but they knew how to save, invest, and sometimes turn their fame into fortune. No one here cracked the 9-digit mark, but compared to earlier generations, this was a genuine financial liftoff. Dwight D. Eisenhower, from farm boy to Gettysburg gentleman. Eisenhower spent most of his life in the army. Noble, yes, but a general's paycheck won't make you a Rockefeller. His fortune blossomed later when he purchased a 250-acre farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Land values soared, his memoirs sold like hotcakes, and the prestige of being the man who beat Hitler didn't hurt either. By the time he passed, Ike's estate was worth about $10 million in today's dollars. A textbook case of modest living, smart investing, and leaving behind a home that became as iconic as his D-Day command. Ronald Reagan, from Hollywood soundstage to global superstar. Reagan started in Hollywood, then swapped scripts for speeches in Sacramento, and finally the White House. His real payday, though, came after he left office. In 1989, one speaking tour in Japan brought him $2 million, about $4 million today, for just a few hours on stage. Add a best-selling memoir and his beloved California ranch, and Reagan became the model of the modern ex-president. Less statesman, more international celebrity. Think less Oval Office, more box office. Richard Nixon, from scandal to comeback cash. Watergate destroyed his reputation, but ironically, it saved his finances. Nixon struck a deal with British journalist David Frost for a series of televised interviews, pulling in $600,000 around $2, $5 million today. He followed it up with multiple books that sold briskly. The Paradox, the scandal that sank his career, became the platform that rebuilt his bank account. History once again plays dirty tricks. George H.W. Bush, oil in the veins, cash in the bank. Bush Sr. came from a connected family, but his personal wealth didn't come from Washington. It came from Texas oil. He co-founded an offshore drilling company and made serious money before entering politics. By the time he took the presidential oath, his government salary was little more than pocket change. Bush represents the type who built wealth first, then went into politics. A reminder that the road to the White House can start in an oil field just as easily as a law office. Grover Cleveland, the lawyer-investor of Westland. Cleveland was born poor, worked hard as a lawyer, and invested smartly, especially in the stock market. When he retired, he enjoyed life at Westland, his estate in Princeton, New Jersey. By modern estimates, his wealth landed in the multi-millions, proof that careful investing and steady saving could lift a man from modest roots to millionaire status. Martin Van Buren, the Lindenwood legacy. Van Buren worked his way up as a lawyer, then Secretary of State, then President. Unlike others, he didn't squander his money. Instead, he bought Lindenwood, a 225-acre estate in New York. That single purchase became the cornerstone of his fortune, landing him in the $10, $50 million range today. A reminder that sometimes the smartest financial move isn't flashy, it's buying land and holding it. Or, as every real estate agent in America says, location, location, location. The asset builders show us the first presidents who blended public office with private acumen. They weren't tycoons, but they weren't living paycheck to paycheck either. They understood the long game: land, books, investments. Enough to live well and enough to be remembered not just for policies, but for property. But if $10, $50 million sounds impressive, history has more surprises. Some presidents and their families climbed even higher, into the Centi-Million Club, where estates stretched for miles, dynasties flourished, and fortunes broke the $100 million barrier. And that's where our story heads next. Now we've entered the 100 million tier. At this level, we're no longer talking about living comfortably. These are the presidents with sprawling estates, business empires, or post-presidency careers that turned into gold mines. Herbert Hoover, a millionaire before the White House. Most presidents didn't strike it rich until after leaving office. Hoover was different. Orphaned young, he clawed his way into Stanford, studied mining engineering, and went global, running mines from Australia to Burma, buying shares and stacking wealth like a Gilded Age tycoon. By the time he entered the White House in 1929, Hoover's net worth already neared $100 million in today's dollars. The paradox: he could pull gold out of foreign mountains, but couldn't stop the Great Depression from crushing the American economy right under his nose. Fortune may favor the bold, but not always the president. Lyndon B. Johnson, the Texas radio empire. LBJ was born dirt poor in rural Texas, but politics and a sharp wife changed his fate. In 1943, Lady Bird Johnson bought a struggling little radio station, with some timely FCC licenses, awarded right as her husband sat in Congress. That station turned into a cash machine. Add in a 500-acre Texas ranch, and suddenly the Johnsons weren't just a political dynasty. They were a business empire. By the time LBJ died, his fortune hovered around $100 million. Proof that in America, politics and business often ride the same horse, sometimes a little too conveniently. Bill Clinton from debt to global ATM. When Bill left office in 2001, the Clintons were drowning in legal debt from the Whitewater scandal. They looked more broke than bankers after the 2008 crash. But then came the comeback. Bill landed a $15 million book deal. Hillary scored $14 million of her own, and both hit the international speaking circuit where a single talk could fetch 6 figures. Within a decade, their combined fortune topped $100 million. The Clintons turned political brand into financial brand, proof that charisma on the campaign trail can cash out big in the global marketplace. Barack Obama, Netflix, books, and the Hollywood presidency. Obama didn't come from old money. His fortune came after the White House. Together with Michelle, he signed a Netflix production deal estimated around $50 million. Then came the books, A Promised Land and Becoming. The latter alone bringing Michelle a $65 million advance. In just a few short years, their family wealth hit the $100 million range. Obama's story marks a new era. Ex-presidents aren't just speakers or memoirists. They are Hollywood players, streaming producers, and cultural moguls. Washington by day, Netflix by night. The Centi-Million Club represents the bridge between comfortable millionaires and the mega-rich. Here we see presidents leveraging books, speeches, media, and sometimes a little political timing to transform influence into empires. They didn't just retire, they rebranded. But beyond the 100 million line lies a different breed. The land barons, the dynasts, the founding fathers who owned estates so vast they were practically kingdoms. Thousands of acres, hundreds of workers, fortunes built on plantations and land grants. This is the world of old money and mega estates. And the men who made the presidency look a lot like aristocracy. At this tier, we're no longer talking about comfortable wealth. These presidents lived like landed lords, measured not in cash but in acres, mansions, and dynastic estates. Their fortunes reached into the hundreds of millions in today's dollars. Yet wealth didn't always bring happiness, and the financial legacies of America's early leaders were often painted with tragedy. Thomas Jefferson, a philosopher, land-rich, debt-poor. Jefferson inherited over 3,000 acres from his father, expanded it to 5,000 and built Monticello, the mansion so iconic it still graces the nickel. Over the course of his life, more than 600 enslaved people labored there. At his peak, Jefferson's fortune reached an estimated $250 million in today's dollars. But Jefferson had expensive tastes: French wines, European furniture, and one of the finest private libraries in America. His debts piled higher than his ideals. By the time he died, his family had to sell Monticello and human beings to cover the bills. A bitter paradox. One of the richest men of his era died like a debtor. James Madison, the Montpelier dynasty and its collapse. Madison was born into privilege at Montpelier, a vast plantation worth around $140 million in today's terms. During his life, he lived like a Virginia aristocrat, but disaster struck through his stepson, John Payne Todd, a drunk and a gambler. Todd squandered money so recklessly that Madison was forced to sell land and bail him out repeatedly. When Madison died, his widow Dolly was left nearly destitute. She even sold off the house and presidential artifacts to survive. It's a stark reminder. One reckless heir can burn down a dynasty faster than a torch to a tobacco barn. Andrew Jackson, from orphan to plantation baron. Jackson grew up poor, orphaned early, and clawed his way up as a lawyer, general, and political strongman. His fortune came from land. In 1804, he bought the Hermitage, a modest estate, and expanded it into more than 1,000 acres worked by roughly 150 enslaved people. By his death, his net worth was about $130 million today. Jackson embodied America's ultimate rags-to-riches story, but with a dark undercurrent, wealth built on the backs of the enslaved. George Washington, America's wealthiest founding father. If one president deserves the title of land baron-in-chief, it's Washington. He inherited Mount Vernon, expanded it into an 8,000-acre estate, and held more than 300 enslaved workers. Beyond that, he acquired some 52,000 acres scattered across Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky. He even ran the nation's largest whiskey distillery at the time. At his peak, Washington's fortune is estimated at $590 million in today's dollars. But even the father of his country was land-rich, cash-poor. He often had to borrow short-term just to cover household expenses and staff salaries. Washington's true financial portrait: a man drowning in acres, starving for liquid cash. The old money and mega estates presidents remind us that early American wealth was tied not to Wall Street or Netflix deals, but to land, and tragically to slavery. These fortunes built grandeur, yes, but also debts, disputes, and legacies that remain morally complicated to this day. And yet, even Washington, with nearly $600 million in today's money, was still just a land giant. By the 20th century, a new kind of wealth emerged: presidents who stepped into the Billionaire Club. Fortunes measured not in acres, but in billions of dollars, and controversy that hasn't stopped since. For more than 2 centuries, American presidents built wealth from land, farms, investments, or books. But only 2 names ever get tossed into the billionaire conversation, and each for very different reasons. John F. Kennedy, a billionaire on paper. JFK was born into the Kennedy dynasty, one of the richest and most powerful families of 20th century America. His father, Joseph Kennedy, built a vast fortune in banking, real estate, stock trading, and even Hollywood. His wife, Jackie, came from a family tied to the Standard Oil legacy. If you roll the entire Kennedy family fortune together, estimates top $1 billion in today's dollars. But here's the catch: that wasn't John F. Kennedy's personal piggy bank. Much of it sat in trusts, inheritances, and investments controlled by the wider family. That's why historians caution JFK wasn't a personal billionaire. He was a member of a billionaire dynasty. He embodied modern old money, living in luxury, yes, but also carrying the weight and expectations of an empire built by others. Donald Trump, the real estate and media billionaire. If Kennedy represented inherited wealth, Trump was the opposite. He built his public persona around being rich. Born into a New York real estate family, he expanded into hotels, golf courses, skyscrapers, and most famously, the global Trump brand. His fortune swings wildly depending on who's counting and when. In 2024, Forbes and Bloomberg pegged his net worth somewhere between $5 and $7 billion, driven by his media ventures, real estate holdings, and brand licensing. But Trump's wealth isn't just money, it's theater. Mar-a-Lago, the 126-room estate worth hundreds of millions, doubles as both mansion and political stage. His private jet, splashed with the Trump name, became part of his brand as much as his campaign. Trump represents the modern billionaire president, part businessman, part entertainer, part politician. A man whose fortune is as much about branding as it is about balance sheets. The Billionaire Club shows the two extremes of American wealth at the presidency. The dynastic heir who lived amid inherited luxury, and the showman mogul who turned his name into a global trademark. Together, they remind us that presidential wealth has never followed one script. From log cabins to marble estates, from bankruptcy to billions, the money trail of American presidents is as unpredictable as history itself. And so, from broke boys to billionaires, the wealth of U.S. presidents tells a bigger story. About America itself, its risks, its rewards, its myths of hard work, and its realities of power and privilege. And so, from presidents who died with just $80 in their pocket, to the plantation lords who owned thousands of acres, to the modern figures whose fortunes stretch into the billions, history shows us one truth. Political power and financial wealth don't always ride in the same carriage. Lincoln was poor in cash, but rich in an immortal legacy. Jefferson looked like a paper millionaire, yet died buried in debt. Washington was not only the father of his country, but also one of its greatest land barons. Reagan, Clinton, and Obama proved that in the modern age, post-presidency can be the real gold mine. And Trump embodied something entirely new, a president who was also a global brand worth billions. Which president's fortune surprised you the most? Do you think wealth, or the lack of it, shaped how they governed? And if you were a financial advisor to a president, what would be your very first piece of advice? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because history, like money, is never short of surprises and debates. And that wraps up our journey from the Broke Boy Club to the Billionaire Club. A tale part tragedy, part comedy, and above all, a reminder that the men who sat in the White House weren't just leaders. They were human, juggling glory and debt, honor and ambition, just like the rest of us. If you enjoyed this ride through presidential fortunes, give this video a like, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the untold stories of American presidents. Because history isn't just about dates and battles. It's also about dollars and cents. And sometimes, that's where the juiciest lessons hide.